Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jan Hagen. I'm an associate professor here at ESMT, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's open lecture with Dr. Etay Shilony on learning and unlearning from the Israeli entrepreneurship experience. For those of you who are new to ESMT, we're an institution that was founded in 2002 by 25 leading international companies and organizations, creating an international business school here in Berlin. In 2006, we opened this campus, the former States Council building of the GDR. And since then, we offer programs, MBA program, an executive MBA program, we have the Masters in Management program, and we have executive education programs that we run for national and international participants. To give you an idea, our full-time MBA program consists of students from 68 students from countries of which 90% are not German. So we're definitely an international institution. Since 2009, we're having this series of open lectures where we try to focus on current issues of intellectual concern. And we've created many renowned international speakers who shared their findings on a wide range of topics. About half a year ago, I spoke to Doron Abrahami, who is the Minister of Commercial Affairs for the Israeli Embassy here in Germany. And he mentioned Etay Shilony's name to me and suggested we two get in touch because we both share an interest in leadership in organizations. Based on that introduction from Doron, I contacted Etay, and we, I think, had a very thought-provoking discussion that in the end led to this event. And I invited Etay to come here from Tel Aviv to Berlin and talk about his thoughts, what is special about the Israeli entrepreneurial spirit. I very much like to thank Doron Abrahami for that initiating that inspiring exchange. And I think it is more than appropriate that Doron, you actually do the formal introduction of Etay instead of me. But before doing so, I'm obliged also to say a few words of thank you. Thank you very much for our media partners, Der Tagesspiegel and the Harvard Business Manager, and especially to the Israeli Embassy for supporting this event. But now, I think over to you, Doron, for the introduction.
Thank you very much, Professor Hagen. It's a great privilege to me to be here at the ESMT in this historic location with the great audience and the great speaker. And I have the pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Etay Shilony. Dr. Etay Shilony is the founder and CEO of S2R, Strategy to Results, received his PhD in clinical psychology from the Boston University. Dr. Shilony's experience in management dates back to the late 80s and early 90s when he served as general director to a chain of clinics in Boston. Upon his return to Israel in 1993, he established and directed the Miriam and Sheldon Edelson Clinic at the Soresky Medical Center in Tel Aviv. Dr. Shilony held faculty appointments at Boston University, Harvard University Medical School, and Tel Aviv University. For the past 12 years, Dr. Shilony has been teaching management, human resources management, and entrepreneurship management at the Interdisciplinary Center, IDC Herzliya graduate programs. Dr. Shilony was recently appointed adjunct lecturer at IDC. The establishment and management of S2R, Strategy to Results, brings together Dr. Shilony's vast managerial experience, combined in-depth academic and practical understanding of leadership, management, organization behavior, group behavior, system functioning, and more. Dr. Etay Shilony is the author of Managementology by Keter Books and with Gilad Rabinovich, a book which combines theory and practice destined to lead and direct managers in their coping with managerial position. He is also published extensively in both academic and popular magazines in Israel and abroad. Most recently, Dr. Shilony has published his second book on management titled Israelism. The book provides an analysis to the Israeli culture. Without further ado, I would like to invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. How do I move to the presentation? It happens just miraculously. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Doron, for the introduction, both of myself this evening and the introduction to Professor Hagen. And thank you, Professor Hagen, for having me here tonight. I have been following the Israeli entrepreneurial industry for about 15 to 20 years, and the Israeli management for about 20 years from both practical and academic perspectives. And I made an effort to put all this together into this book, which I will describe some of its elements to you this evening, which I titled Israelism. It's trying to make some sort of euphemism of what Israel management is about. Doron did a very good job at presenting me. I will skip this slide, but you can see me smiling to you and keep imagining this as we separate tonight. Israel has been coined startup nation. It is, I think by now, a well-known fact that Israel is one of the leading hubs of the world for the startup industry. There are about almost 1,000 startups opening each year in Israel, and about 50 to 60% of them closing or shutting down each year in Israel. I will discuss this a little bit later. Many of the startups in Israel result from the cybersecurity ecosystem that is funneled through the Israeli Defense Forces and the Ministry of Defense in Israel. That has a lot of meanings, not only in terms of the industry, but also in terms of who are these entrepreneurs that are behind this ecosystem, and that is a part of my presentation. Last night at the university where I teach, we have this event where managers who register to a particular program meet a major figure, Israeli figure, once a month. And we met last night, 24 hours ago, with Israel's Minister of Defense. And he was proud to say that it's important that Israel has about 5.4 of its funds allocated to defense, mainly because at the end of the day, these resources are funneled back into the startup ecosystem. So it's good to have a strong defense system from his perspective. It's good for economy. War is good for economy. This is something that we are all aware of. In any event, in Israel, many of these startups result from intelligence units in the military. And when we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about cybersecurity in the broad sense of the word. It's not just following up on people over the internet. It's this whole ability to have intelligent big data analysis that is not only of what people write, but also of where people are at, how they feel, behave, interact over the internet or in the real world. So this ecosystem is growing and growing in Israel. I just learned that outside of one of Israel intelligence units, Amazon, who is now filtering to the Israeli market, has put huge signs that promises whoever is discharged from that unit a $15,000 to $20,000 salary a month if right after they're discharged from the military they sign up to work for Amazon. So imagine an intelligence base with these signs outside luring people to come and work for Amazon once they're finished with their military service. And Israel has become a synonym to innovation, and there's, I think, curiosity in the world of entrepreneurship, how this happens and what this is about, and if entrepreneurship has to do with innovation. So then we try to figure out, okay, what is it about the Israeli culture that creates that innovation? What makes it tick, and what is this all about? There's a major discrepancy between the number of startups that rise in Israel to the very low number of companies that result out of these startups and end up as large-scale Israeli companies. And I was just briefly discussing this with Doron. Doron said maybe we don't need to have large companies built out of the Israeli startup ecosystem, but in terms of Israel creating jobs and sort of supporting economy by this endless amount of startups, Israel is not really gaining at the end of the day from the fact that it's a hub for all this kind of system. And even some of the companies that have become famous because they were sold by huge amounts of money, at the end of the day do not continue to function in Israel, besides maybe some sort of R&D centers. So I got curious about this gap. What is it, on the one hand, that creates this startup hub, and what is it about Israel or Israelis or Israeli management that doesn't provide groundwork for this ecosystem to flourish into real companies? And I want to say a number of things about that. The first thing I want to say is that Israelis, by and large, they glorify the lack of process. And by glorifying the lack of process, Israelis also glorify the lack of strategy. So if companies that sort of need to grow, need to have sort of strategic foundation, that is not something we Israelis are good at. Not only we're not good at it, but we sort of believe in our ability to manage without planning. And we build a lot on intuition, improvisation. For those who are familiar with the Jewish holidays, during Jewish holidays, we celebrate improvisation and lack of planning. We always survived at the last minute by some sort of unplanned event. We leave Egypt, from Egypt to Zion, to Israel, and there's a lot of problems along the way. Problems with navigation, with supply chain management. This whole thing takes 40 years instead of a month or two. And then, like in good companies, there's an ideology created to explain the endless problems along the way. We say, oh, this was for the generation that left Egypt to sort of replace itself. We celebrate Hanukkah. For those who are familiar with Hanukkah, there are a lot of problems there. The oil should have not been lasted enough. At the end, they find sort of this small can that lasts for 8 days. All these stories are about nothing was planned, miracles happened, and somehow there was some sort of improvisation that took care of it all. So thinking about this is sort of a very slight political aside to this. Thinking about Israel as a nation, maybe it was good at being a startup as a nation, but now when we really need to run a country, that's a different story. Because we were very sort of good at creating it from scratch against all odds, but now we need to run a business. Last night I asked the Minister of Defense, he described how we were good at doing this and doing that, and with Hamas and everything, for those of you who follow, and I said, okay, where is the discussion about where is this going, like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? He looked at me puzzled and says, I don't know. He said, strategies maybe in China and Singapore. You can't find it in Israeli government. So that's from a person who sits there. It's not like a rumor or anything. Anyway, so one thing is sort of the one element to understand this phenomenon is our nature, our improvisation, lack of process and strategy kind of nature. Another major element, I think, is the fact that Israel is a post-traumatic nation. Yours truly is here on the picture. I know it's difficult to recognize, but this is me, 1982, the Lebanon War. I am a commander of about 100 soldiers, and one wonders what does this do to a generation of Israeli managers or entrepreneurs? Going back to my initial statement that major Israeli startups arise from the military. So what does it mean that management, Israeli managers and Israeli entrepreneurs grow up in sort of a military environment? Let's talk about the positive elements, or what I think are the positive elements. In the military, you learn to become self-reliant. You learn about camaraderie and about teamwork. You learn about what it means to be dependent on your teammates and so on. You learn a lot about full responsibility and other good values like that. But also thinking of the military experience as a foundation for management, the military experience does not teach you win-win. It does not teach you negotiation. It does not teach you anything about marketing and sales, and it does not teach you anything about what do you do in a world without command systems, where you need to persuade, you need to move about, you need to tie people into your dream and vision. The military doesn't teach. So if you take a group of people, whether these being sort of good folks like myself, I wasn't into technology or anything, but my management experience comes from this experience, or people who grew up in the military sort of technological sort of aspect. What does it mean that is the school that they come from? What does it mean about their management styles, the way they look at business? So you see the good sides and you see the challenging sides. The good sides, you see people who can think out of the box. They know what to do. They're self-reliant and so on and so forth. But also when it comes to building enterprises and laying foundations and thinking strategically and not working tactically, then I think you can understand why this very intelligent group of people lacks skills and does not develop the skills that necessitates sort of growing up in terms of building companies. And the third last element that I talk about in this book is the fact that we Jewish people toy around with the idea that we are sort of the chosen people. And we have this ambivalence towards the nations of the world. On the one hand, we sort of like the fact that Israel is a Jewish state and we struggle with it. Is it a democracy? Is it Jewish? I'm not going to go into this any further, but is it a Jewish state, sort of small and struggling for itself, or are we sort of a cosmopolitan kind of environment? Are we a small nation that needs the help of the superpowers, or are we a superpower ourselves? We have this ambivalent relationship with the world. We admire anything that happens outside of Israel, let me tell you. We admire the Americans, and we admire the French, and we admire the Germans. We admire the Japanese. When an Israeli manager is appointed, he starts traveling, definitely if he's a minister or she's a minister, we start traveling all over the world to learn what is done out there, because this is where we want to bring in ideas. And yet, on the other hand, we think that anything that is outside of our country is not top notch. And we're sort of best at being strong, and we're best at being victims at the same breath. So there's this ambivalence that is maybe relevant to a country that's 70 years old, but it's very relevant to the question: are we for real, or are we kind of still struggling for survival? So if you think about these three elements that I discussed here, one is the belief in improvisation, lack of structure, strategy, and so on. Two, the belief in the military as the sort of basis for our post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning we will be strong, therefore we will never be victimized again. And three, this ambivalence about who we are, Jewish, Israeli, and so on. You see a complicated, unresolved issues that have to do with lack of vision. And when you lack vision, you cannot build strong, lasting enterprises, in my perspective. It's not that you can't, but you're limited in your abilities to do so. So what are the lessons that can be learned, I think, yet from the Israeli experience? And I will now talk to you as an audience, but also tell you what is it that I say to Israeli entrepreneurs. Their challenge is to shift from cutting corners to creativity and innovation. And there are many companies that are able to do that systematically. And the more they sort of live and see how the world functions, the more they learn to do that. I think also that another lesson to be learned is the shift from power to strength. The fact that you are strong doesn't mean you have to exert power. So you can be strong without using power. That is another element that I think Israelis in this world can learn. And last, related to this chosen people aspect, I think we can learn, entrepreneurs can learn to sort of use less hubris and more empathy. At the end of the day, the ability to persuade, sell, develop products and so on has to do with your ability to be empathic to needs of others. And the values that one can take from the Israeli experience, that rules are to be challenged. Israelis are good at that, and I think that that's an element that they can really bring into companies and help them strive. Israelis are good at out-of-the-box thinking, and companies that can systematically think out of the box and create these innovative processes can be better off. Israelis believe that anything can be done, and Israelis believe that relationships are key. I'll give you a brief story about this. I studied in Boston from my master's and PhD degrees. And as an Israeli studying at Tel Aviv University, I was used to this idea that the students, the basic role of the Israeli students is to fight the system and to find ways to sort of do less and get more. So I was an entrepreneur as a student, okay? So I come to Boston and I sit in a classroom, a course about Freud. Those of you who studied psychology know that there's this thing called the Standard Edition of Freud's writings. It's like 24 volumes. The man wrote endlessly. In any event, the professor says, okay, you guys need to read about 50, 60 pages of Freud every week and summarize it and so on. So I hear this and I look to my left, I look to my right. I talked to the student on my right and I said, look, let's do this. I will summarize 1 week. Okay, I'm an entrepreneur, remember. I will summarize 1 week, you will summarize the other week, and we will share the information. And this guy looks at me and he says, why? Why? And these bridges of culture happen in any culture, but it's because Israel is a small country that needs the world in order to do things. So Israelis need to learn more about how to manage. I'll give you just another brief example. I was working with an Israeli company that had an R&D center in Pune in India, because it's cheap there, cheaper there to have all these QA systems and so on. And I was interviewing the managers there, and a manager in India showed me an email he received from an Israeli manager, and he says, this was the most insulting email I received in my life. And I asked him to share with me, so he twists the screen, and the email says, what about what you promised, question mark. Now, in Hebrew, what about what you promised kind of flies. It's not like an insult. And I was telling my wife, I was exchanging emails with Professor Hagen in the last few weeks or so, and it's really delighting to write every email like with 3 paragraphs. First paragraph, thank you for your email. It was really nice to talk to you again, and so on and so forth. It's like, it's a pleasant music to my ears after living in Israel for so long. And I was trying to say this to the people in India, and as I was explaining this difference, the vice president who I was with received a phone call, and he says in Hebrew, it's irrelevant. Okay, now what was the phone call? He put his car for sale, and someone calls him on the phone, and he says, the Israeli on the phone says, it's about the car. And my friend says to him, it's irrelevant. Okay, that's the conversation, and they hang up. Now, no one is insulted here. This is cool in Israeli terms, okay? So you need to understand what we're talking about when we talk about cultural differences. This is like a major gap. But if you look at this philosophically or semi-philosophically, what is it about? It's about cutting red tape. It's about cutting to the chase. It's about let's minimize our processes and so on and so forth for the sake of being lean, of being agile. It's not all bad, this stuff. If Israeli entrepreneurs are not persuaded by this conversation so far, I tell them, look, there's research about startups in the world that those who listened or are followed by venture capitalists are better off than those who are not, meaning kids need parents. And so that's one thing I tell them, look, you want to survive, you need to listen. You need to have parents. You need to listen to your parents. So that's one effort that if you work with Israelis, you can use this sort of, you can use this notion that kids need parents. Entrepreneurs need parents. Another take on this is from another researcher reported at Harvard Business Review, is that if you look at Israeli startups, because the world is interested in Israeli startups, those who are followed or funded by non-Israeli founders or by non-Israeli investors are better off than those who are funded or followed by Israelis alone. That is, if Israelis manage Israelis and Israelis fund Israelis, the chances of the startup to survive is reduced. So that's another angle at making an effort to persuade Israelis to listen. And last but not least, I suggest the use of power. There's a lot of research done about startups in the Silicon Valley, about what the authors here, Davila and Foster, called the adoption of management systems. And turns out that startups who adopt management systems early on, the survival of the CEO, of the founder as CEO later on, is the chances are that he or she will remain as CEOs. Whereas if they do not adopt management systems early on, chances are that they will be replaced by a real manager. So I do my best to persuade Israeli entrepreneurs or those who work with Israeli entrepreneurs that they need to listen, that they need to involve foreigners in their system, and they need to adopt management systems or else they will be replaced. If we summarize all this, there is a tension between innovation and systematic work. It's not easy to resolve this sort of tension, because innovation is, in a way, anti-systematic. Innovation is about doing things differently. Innovation is about doing things that were never done before. Things that were never done before, by definition, have not been tried as things that were done before endless amount of times. So if you're able to put in one room this sort of innovative, out-of-the-box, not following the rules type of thinking, whether these being in companies that work with Israelis or in companies that do not but need to foster these kinds of values, and you're able to combine it with systematic management work, then you hit the jackpot. And one of the sort of solid books on innovation, entrepreneurship, comes from Peter Drucker, who wrote about a lot of solid books on management. And I will end by a quote from him saying, "Systematic innovation consists in the purposeful and organized search for changes, and in the systematic analysis of the opportunities such changes might offer for economic or social innovation." That is, the ability to look at this innovation as a behavior that results from a combination of values of order and Israelism, then you're better off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Etay, for this very inspiring, broad picture. What I suggest is that we take up seats here at the front. And what I'd like to do is basically open a dialogue between you and the audience here. And only to give you an idea, what we intend to do is to have a Q&A session of, well, about 20 to 30 minutes maximum, and then head off to pick up some snacks and maybe continue the conversation, only to give you an idea. I've seen your question. What I suggest is I have, when I invited you, I had a few questions myself, although I will not speak long. But one thing that struck me also when listening to your speech, you mentioned the thing about startups and their values, and you also mentioned what I think is quite interesting to say, well, Israel was very successful as a startup nation. Now it's a different stage. We have to be grown up. And the same is what we see as companies. Yeah? The companies grow up as startups, and at some point they have to become grown up. What about the transition phase? You gave a few insights, but what are the elements that create a successful transition from the one phase to the other one? Because you cannot obviously start from scratch as a formal organization with all long-term views and so on. Lots is in the early stages is experimenting, improvising, like you said, but at some point you have to change. What is the ideal point, or what is the ideal framework for having a successful transition from your perspective?
That's a very good and interesting question, because it's not a dichotomy between being a child and being a grown-up. At the middle, there's this phase of adolescence, which is indeed a difficult phase. We have 3 daughters, and each one of them went through this period differently. And we have 2 daughters in their 20s, and one continues to be funded by our fund, and shows no signs of growing up into a real enterprise, while the other grew up in a very similar environment and shows signs of growing up from maybe a too early stage. I think that it takes 2 things. One, it takes leadership that is able to look ahead at these kinds of transitions and see the organization or the country a little bit from above, and be able to plant and plan the elements that will make it possible to shift from one stage to another. I also think that in our country there are leaders who were both visionaries, but were also able to plant enough seeds that the visions kind of carry through strategy and then structure and then culture. I think it's also true for organizations. And I think that is where leadership is combined with management. Management sort of can take an organization within its phase. Leadership can lead organizations from phase to phase. But leadership alone, vision alone, doesn't sort of carry through. You need management systems. So the vision that our daughter will end up living on her own is not enough. I guess we need to have some sort of consequences on her continuing to occupy a third of our apartment. I'm just sharing this because I need some support from the group.
One aspect that you broadly touched within the book and also here in the lecture is the role of the military. I think it's prevalent in the society because everybody has to go to lengthy military service time that has certain elements in socializing people, and you're at points very critical about these elements. Use of force, for example, I think was a very interesting perspective. But then on the other side, I think what, from my perspective, when I looked at the development of people in Israel, what I realized is you have to take on responsibility relatively early in your life. Yeah? And what you just mentioned, also with regard to the startups, the role of the leader. Is that something that on the one side it is critical, and no way, I think it's very clear that the military is not a good management school, but in terms of leadership, aren't there positive elements as well in bringing people to that role of taking responsibility for others, being in a position where they have to move up very quickly to challenges that what they never had to do in other Western countries, for example?
I will start by a brief statement. There's a cliche in Israel that Israel is a military with a country. The military that has a country as opposed to a country that has military. And that is because the Israeli military is so well-rooted in Israeli society, not only because the service is mandatory for everybody, but also because its role in the establishment of Israel was not only to defend the country, but also to serve as a melting pot for Israeli society. That was one of the sort of visions of David Ben-Gurion, who sort of was the first prime minister and also the first minister of defense, sort of rooted that in Israeli society, that that's the role of the military. So the military, the Israeli military has a civil role parallel to its defense aspects. As I become more and more mature looking at this, I'm a little bit more cynical about the type of leadership that the military provides. I think that also if you look at Israeli history, the great leaders of Israel were not necessarily great generals. And if they were generals, their leadership, from my perspective, the positive periods of history were in their second term. So if we look at Rabin as Yitzhak Rabin, who was chief of staff, I think there's an agreement that he was a better prime minister in his second term, when he was far away from being in the military. I think this is same for Arik Sharon. When the further he was from the military experience, the better he was as prime minister. I think that the military experience does provide you, as I said, sort of this early experience of the maturity and the responsibility, and all that is very important. But basically, it's an organization that exerts power and uses power as its major language. And management and leadership is more than just using power, particularly in democracies. So the further I look into this, the less I see that as sort of a school for leaders, of civil leaders, or leaders for civil society, and so on and so forth.
Okay, well, it's a situation that you cannot change, but there are some elements that are positive, but others that you probably would rather put aside. One thing that struck me from your presentation was when you looked at the success rates of companies with Israeli ownership, foreign and total foreign ownership. When looking at Berlin as a startup startup location, and Tel Aviv, there's a lot of talk about these two centers and collaboration. We have a lot of companies who are at both locations. Is that something, when you look also at the elements that you describe, that you have these cultural specialties in Israel, but we also have them as Germans, and then we also maybe are both international locations, not only having our own people, but people from lots of other countries. I mean, is that something that is helpful?
I think that's very smart in terms of really putting in a melting pot the strengths of these two types. If we look at this stereotypically, type of subcultures. One, as we described, more intuitive, out of the box, and so on. Another, without insulting anyone, more sort of planned, organized, and so on. I think this is a good experience. I think also there are a lot of Israelis that thrive in Silicon Valley. I think for similar reasons. It's combining the Israelism, so to speak, with the corporate America, which has its own strengths. We need to remember that sort of the Amazon, Facebook, Google, the giants, these giants grew up in corporate America. The sort of the corporate America, but also German companies. I work in Israel with Volkswagen, AIG. I mean, there's a lot to be learned from the corporate giants about how to run systems. So I think that what is happening here in Berlin and other places where these kinds of cultures are combined are good for all sides involved.
Okay, thank you very much. So even though you may have feared that I talk for ages, I'm happy now over to give the floor to you. And I think you had a question very early on, so then over to you first. And we have to use the microphone because we're recording it for the live stream, only that you know that.
Hello. So in order to make innovations and to make
Can you just say a word about who, if it's okay, with the rules of the game, who you are, what is it that you do, or something of that kind?
Alexander Voskanyan, a political scientist at Humboldt University.
Okay.
And in order to make innovations in startups, you need inspirations, especially in the cybersecurity area. And the cybersecurity area is a very international business, and there are so many changes, and they are so specific in all the regions of the world. So there's a specific Russian one, a specific American, a specific European. For instance, Iceland and Ireland, and you have to keep up with them.
Right.
And as you said, your situation is ambivalent. You have a ambivalent relationship with the world,
right?
And you say that you are just a small country. So how do you keep the pace with the developments in the whole world, and where do you get your inspirations?
Well. I'll answer your question from a management perspective, and then slightly from a political perspective, since this is where you're coming from. From a management perspective, threats create necessity, and threats create improvisation, and threats are inspiring. So if you look at Israel as a country that is surrounded by enemies from close and from afar, and it's a small country that needs to defend itself, and so on and so forth. So part of its ability to defend itself is being larger than it really is. And being larger than it really is by being able to predict early on what the enemy is going to do, what the enemy is thinking, and so on and so forth, rather than dealing with the enemy when it's attacked. It's that is a strategic aspect of Israel's way of defending itself, is trying to be smart on the intelligence end, knowing that on the battlefield it's surrounded by hundreds of millions of potential enemy countries. From a political perspective, there are advantages to war and advantages to peace, and disadvantages to both. There is disadvantage to war and disadvantage to peace. And if you're cynical about this, you will think that the economy, the Israel defense system that is mainly supported by American money, and so on and so forth, without getting too heavy into conspiracies, that in and of itself has a system that needs to feed itself. So there's reality and there's economy, and somehow they live together and create this inspiration that you're talking about.
But you need new inspirations, new informations. So you can't get it just from within your country. You need new informations. You need the links to the whole world.
Yeah, I
because it's so much happening in the whole world, and you can't get the information just from within your country.
You see, so this is what's, I think, funny about us. We travel, we study abroad, we bring information into the country, we teach outside of the country, and we, on the one hand, know we're kind of small, and on the other, we think we're kind of big. So somehow that ambivalence is managed, but we are in touch with the world. We're just ambivalent about doing so.
Okay, thank you. I think you had a question, so seen you, and I think there was one.
Thanks a lot. Hello, my name is Axel Noack. I teach international business at Hochschule Stralsund, a bit north of here. I would like to get a bit of an understanding of the microcosm you were talking about. So if you have 1,000 startups in Israel a year, how many of those, just a rough figure, are not from the military background, and how many of those are not sort of cybersecurity? And that leads me to the broader, more ethical questions. So as Ray Kurzweil pointed out, has been pointing out for a long while, we don't live in a linear development anymore. It's exponential, yeah. So exponential technological development, talking about big data and so on. And you, Israel, with that microcosm, are leading the world in cybersecurity. If we do a bit of exponential thinking, I wonder where this is all taking us to. So I think you will have a mind-boggling amount of power. Maybe you want to give us some insights where this is all leading. And the question is there any ethical discussion about this? You mentioned Israeli attitude, so vision is not your thing, and strategy?
I don't want to mistake with the figures because I don't have that in front of me, but to the best of my recollection, and maybe you know the figures even better, to the best of my recollection, there's about 50 to 60% of startups that are cyber security related, and then there's a chunk that somehow is tied into medical devices, and then there's all the rest. I think the medical device is the medical sort of device area is also kind of big in Israel. In terms of the ethical discussion, I can only say this: since ethics is not an expertise of mine, but at this point of the game, those who know more about you, the common person, not the sort of terrorists of the world or the politicians of the world, are the three giants: Amazon, Google, and Facebook. The cybersecurity world, although it's in the news and maybe it affected the elections and maybe it did this or did that, if we talk about the common people, it's nothing in terms of the amount of manipulation that is done by these giants and the GDPR, the new rules about privacy that were created here in Europe, by the way, are sort of facing mostly those kinds of activities and less so the activities of whoever is playing around with cybersecurity. I'm not saying that Israel or others, the hackers from Russia or what have you, are not involved in things that should be seriously looked at in terms of their effect on our lives, but I think on a day-to-day basis, our information is completely out there, and it's not the cybersecurity world that is playing around with it.
Okay, thank you. I think there was initially a question over
Yes.
there. It was up. Okay, well then over to you, and then thank you, and go to you as well.
So I'll sit here. It's a little bit, I can't see. Sorry. So I have one question. I mean, first of all, I am Nihat Husseinov. I study in this university.
Good for you.
You know, I actually admire your work. So I just want to ask you, as a failed entrepreneur myself, I'm pretty young, I'm 21, but I had this very good idea, and we already, for 6 months, we had this planning and management went on, but I think due to mismanagement and misplanning, we actually failed the idea. But I would like to ask you, given that I'm a very introverted and a person who lacks of connections, and that was a primary issue why the startup failed.
Right.
How can I better myself, and how do I, you know, excel in that area?
It's a good. I'm happy to consult you, my friend. There are 3 wrongdoings that startups go through at early stages. One is that people tend to build startups with people they know and they feel comfortable with, as opposed to building startups with people who bring in elements that they do not share. So since it's about creativity and it's about long hours and it's sort of a relatively social activity, not only a business activity, it's natural that people want to hang out doing it with other people that they're familiar with and feel comfortable with, but they should do otherwise. The team needs to be comprised from people who complement each other, not necessarily people who get along with each other. So that's one thing. The second thing is has to do with consulting with the adults, because adults, the only thing they really have as an advantage is experience. And sometimes entrepreneurs, like kids, they sort of built this thing in their room, and they want to share it with the adults when it's done. And when they show it to the adults, turns out that there's a machine like this in the other basement nearby, or it was done before, or there's no monetization behind it, or a lot of problems. So my advice to people, to entrepreneurs, is to talk to the adults, to good adults, not those who sort of kill your ideas. They're good adults. That's what adolescents have difficulties understanding. Right? They're good adults. That's my second advice. And my third advice is that entrepreneurs sometimes mix creativity with chaos. So they think that if they work in chaos, that means creativity. So they don't follow up on what they do. They don't write plans. They sort of do this, then they do that. Instead of calling it just a mess, they think they're creative, and it's basically a mess. So a messed up room is a messed up room. It's not creativity. So these 3 pieces of advice, if you failed on one of them. Now, I say to people, look, in any event, you're playing in a playground that, if to use the military experience, is 90% covered with mines, because only 10% succeed. So you really want to be careful on how you're walking. Now, and a lot of entrepreneurs, they kind of know that there's a 10% chance, but they act as if there's a 90% chance. They act carelessly in a high-risk environment. And that sort of cognitive aspect needs to be combined. I hope that will lead you to great success.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, first, the gentleman with the green shirt. This one, yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Mark Lair. I'm a professor of management from Suffolk University in Boston.
Oh.
I've been getting
Yeah.
very interested in this issue of Israeli high tech. I've been trying to read everything about this topic that I can, and I certainly will read your book. It sounds very interesting. Two impressions from the reading are the following that are relevant to your talk. The first is that the great majority of Israeli high-tech firms are founded and led by a very special elite of military people who are selected to serve from high school in very specific elite military units like Taupi at 8200 Mamren and so
Right.
forth. And the second impression is that by the same token, the vast majority of educated Israelis who study at the universities are largely excluded from high tech. As I understand it, those great universities that you have, Tel Aviv University, even Technion and so forth, really are not the major players in Israeli high tech.
Right.
And those impressions lead me to ask two very serious questions. The first is, are you really describing Israel as a whole? Or are you just describing that little elite of people in those military elite units? And the second question is, if you want systematic thinking, do you really need to come to Germany? Can't you just go to those Israeli universities like all other countries do and try to get university trained entrepreneurs as opposed to elite military trained entrepreneurs?
These are very interesting viewpoints, obviously, and I thank you for those comments. I'll say two things. One, I think that unfortunately there's a competition between these two ecosystems. The sort of the one that is built on the military, those elite units that you have mentioned, and the universities. I meet, and I can, I'll say it bluntly as an Israeli, I need to sort of do that from time to time. When I meet students that study entrepreneurship at the university or management that have background from one of these units, the amount of ego that is present in the room feels like it pressures the windows, sort of. And I found myself saying to them, to a team, that as part of what I do as teaching that course is I meet with those teams that they need to create within the program. They need to create a startup. So I meet with them as teams, and I can tell the teams that are built on those folks from with the military background, it's as if you can't talk to them at all. Seriously, they know everything. They've been everywhere. Academia has nothing to teach them, and even financially or economically, academia has nothing to promise them, because you don't see the signs of Amazon outside of the Technion, and you don't see the signs of Amazon outside of Tel Aviv University's engineer computer science program. You see those signs out of 8200. So if you want to take this further, and I don't want to sort of bore the audience with this, but if you want to take this further, there's a competition between the Israeli civil society and the Israeli militant military society, and who's running the future of the country. So this goes your two very well outlined points go very deep into Israeli society, and are not resolved. Israel has not resolved issues of state and religion. It has not resolved issues of military versus civil. It has not resolved its borders. Are we small? Are we large? Israel has not solved any major vision/strategic aspects of its existence in the last 50 or 60 years. That's a major problem.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I think you had a question, and
I'm Rolf Schneller. I'm beyond the startup phase. I'm a retired German Foreign Service officer, and I teach American students at the Free University at the moment themes and issues in transatlantic relations. I thoroughly enjoyed your discussions, especially after having come back from Israel yesterday. And so you have certainly given me a lot of explanations for things that I noticed.
We should have spoken before.
Yeah, but one thing that I thought was interesting, what you pointed out, the importance of foreign capital and foreign companies in the startup business, startup scene in Israel. And I was wondering, given the importance of connections, knowing people, etc., networking, how much of the international is maybe people who have moved between Israel and the United States, going back and forth? And so how much of the international is really half Israeli, or maybe more?
I following your question, and also the question that was raised here, I feel I need to clarify this point. Israelis travel a lot. They study abroad. I think that in Israeli academia, there is a countless amount of people who had their graduate degrees outside of the country and came back to teach. The IDC, where I teach, has an influx of professors who came from the States mostly, or from Europe. Israelis who traveled and came back. Israelis are fascinated with the Silicon Valley, and they're fascinated with New York, and we're half Americans and we're quarter Europeans, and yet we're not humbled by this. This was my point. Okay, we as a culture, we're not saying, okay, look, there's a great world out there, let's be humble about it. We study from someone, and we think we're better. You see, this is the thing.
My question was maybe not clear enough. My point is, was that possibly that those Israelis who went abroad and are come back with international money, that they maybe bring in things that they have learned, and they know both worlds. They bring them together.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. They come back and they bring in both knowledge and values that they have learned abroad, but this is something that is maybe difficult to describe. Even though cognitively you know that you brought information from someone else, okay? Even when you adopt it and you cognitively know that it wasn't yours, okay? You sort of feel that it was yours to begin with. Do you understand my point? So now that's a complicated phenomena in a way. It has nothing to do with cognitively understanding reality. And also something happens, this is just an aside point, something happens to you after years of, I'll give you an example. I spent almost 7 years in the States. I came back to Israel, and I was a manager of a clinic that was funded with almost endless amounts of money from Sheldon Adelson, who is sort of one of the richest Jews in the world, and we could do whatever we want. And I really came back from Boston. I worked, I grew up in the 80s, in the sort of late 80s in Boston, coming back with all these ideas about power and relational psychology and how to do things in an orderly fashion. And I sit in this in the conference room, and the psychiatrist who was working for me calls the nurse, and he says, "Honey, can you bring the file? Can you bring the file from the nursing station?" And you know, I thought, I felt, I felt as if the police is going to jump in through the windows and sort of grab the psychiatrist and take him to jail. And I looked around and nothing happened. No one even, see, I had professors from Wellesley College, you know what I'm talking about. That is, if you don't say he or she every sentence, you're a male chauvinist. So I was sure that the police is going to jump in through the window and grab him, and nothing happened. No one even heard that there's a problem with this honey bring the file thing, okay? So I guess that what happens to you after a while, because you're not Don Quixote, you don't fight these sort of values again and again, day after day, so you shift back to this Israelism thing. Part of the reason Israelis who spend time in Europe or in the States like to travel again is in order to write emails with 3 paragraphs, like I've been doing with Professor. No, this is not meant as an insult. I said to my wife, this is like music to my ears. People talk politely. You know, this is great.
Okay. Well, one last question. Mm-hmm. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm Diana. I just have, I think I have a solution to your problem.
Good.
About your daughter.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you read the newspapers, but last week.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, of course.
In New York. No, it wasn't New York, actually. It was Florida. So the parents of this young man sued the young man.
We were inspired by this.
Yeah. He sued the young man because he wasn't leaving the house and he was 30. And the judge said, yes, you need to leave. I'm sure you have enough Jewish lawyers.
We were inspired by this story. Yeah.
And anyway, that was just meant as a joke. Jewish lawyers in Israel.
That's okay. Yeah.
So, with everything you've just said, Israel in 2040, what do you see? Everything.
Don't get me started on this.
Just succinctly.
I'm at this point. This is outside of this lecture. This is my personal viewpoint. That is not my sort of from the viewpoint of my expertise. I am kind of pessimistic about where the country is going. I think if you look at this from a management perspective, or if you look at this from parenting perspective, okay, when a family doesn't have clear borders and it doesn't know where it begins and where it ends, and when a family doesn't agree on the major values of the family, then the family is in trouble. So if you look at Israel, as I said in response to the question from the gentleman on my right, Israel is in major disagreement about very serious questions. And there's no sign that, at this point, that Israel can decide for itself where it wants to be. I think that, and I say this often to leaders, if, say the Palestinians, for example, were to come to Israel and say, you know what, we'll sign whatever, okay, here's a map, draw the map, and we'll sign whatever you say. We don't know how to draw the map. So we're lucky enough that the other side is not smarter than us. Because if our counterparts were a little bit smarter than us, because they grew up in the same area, I guess, so the heat does something to both sides. But if they were a bit smarter, then they would say, you know what, guys, whatever you say, okay, with Jerusalem, without Jerusalem, put the line here, put the line, whatever you say, we don't know what to draw. So we're lucky enough that the conflict is so that's only one front. But say the religious parties will say, you know what, guys, draw the line wherever you want, okay? Wherever you want. We don't know what to say. Are we more Jewish than the democracy? Are we more this than that? So And following Professor Hagen's question, what does it take? It takes leadership. So if leadership thrives on the conflict, then leadership has a lot of tools to maintain conflicts, endless amount of tools to maintain conflict, as it has limited tools to stop conflict. So if leadership understands this, that conflict keeps itself, and not only does nothing to resolve it, but thrives on its continuing, and both parties on all fronts benefit from it, then from an organizational perspective, there's no solution.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Etay. I think these are very challenging questions, a very broad range of topics covered. I think the region you come from is definitely a very challenging region. You showed us, I think, some inspiring, thought-provoking lines of thought from your country. I think you were very, at times, very harsh about the weaknesses of your society. And although you didn't and couldn't provide an answer to the last question, I think one of the strengths of the Israeli society as a whole is still the ability to reflect and to adapt to the challenges. And I think going forward, as long as Israel is an open society where dialogue happens and you have that exchange of ideas and different perspectives, I think that is the basis for growing in the future. It would be ideal, as you mentioned, have that long-term strategy, and I think that's I couldn't agree more. But as long as you don't have that, at least you have the other part, and that is hopefully leading to.
You see how important it is for us Israelis to talk to foreigners.
Okay.
We are inspired. We are inspired and optimistic following your comment.
Okay, well, I don't like to conclude the discussion. We can continue the discussion over the snacks. I think they're served at the foyer. Okay, so if you just go out and follow to the foyer, we still have some more opportunity to link up. So far, thank you very much, Etay.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.